This video is going to explore the different sampling methods that we could use in statistics when we're trying to collect our data. And so just as a reminder here, in statistics, the goal is to collect data from an appropriate representative sample and then use that data that we collect to try to make inferences about a larger population of interest. So remember, we're taking data from a sample and using it to try and make inferences about an entire population. One of the hardest parts in a statistical study is often trying to set up the representative sample. And so I want us to first get an idea of what a representative sample means, and then we'll talk about sampling techniques. So we're told here that a representative sample is a sample in which the relevant characteristics of the sample members match those of the population of interest. So I tried to give you an example here that can explain this a little bit better. So suppose that we're studying the variable average income or shoe size of all Americans. So our population of interest is everyone in America, and we're looking at either studying average income or also maybe looking at measuring the variable shoe size. So what I'm getting at here is that we would not likely want to use professional basketball players as our sample, because professional basketball players are not a representative sample in terms of their incomes or their shoe sizes, meaning that they're not similar to all Americans in terms of what their income is or what their shoe size is, right? Both their income and their shoe size are probably much larger than for most Americans. So trying to use professional basketball players, if I was studying average income or shoe size, would not be a good representative sample. However, if we had a different variable of interest, so same population, maybe our population is still all Americans, but this time our variable of interest is different, it's birth month. In that case, professional basketball players might be a perfectly reasonable representative sample, because they shouldn't tend to have any different variability in terms of their birth month or values of their birth month than every other American does. Okay, so it's not necessarily a group that is not representative. It depends on what your variable of interest is. Okay, so moving on, if our goal is to collect a representative sample, we're going to run through 5 of the most common sampling methods. So the first one is simple random sampling. And in simple random sampling, we choose a sample of lowercase n items in such a way that every sample of size n in our population is equally likely of being the sample actually selected. So another way to think about this is that every individual in the population is just as likely as being selected for our sample as everyone else. So a typical example of this would be like drawing names from a hat, right? Or using a random number generator. In a random number generator, I would assign out to each member of my population a number, and then I would randomly generate numbers to be in my sample, and that's how I would pick people. So in the other case where I said an example might be drawing names from a hat, that's not very practical for a large population size, but the random number generator would be. Okay. Another type of sampling is stratified sampling. And I want us to specifically talk about stratified and cluster right next to each other. Those are the two that tend to get confused. So in stratified sampling, what I want us to start off thinking about is that word stratified, and it kind of sounds like strata. And if you're into science or geology, stratified or strata means layers, right? Different layers. And so in statistics, when we do stratified sampling, what we're doing is we're taking our population of interest, so everybody that we're interested in the whole population, we're dividing them into subgroups or strata that we want to make sure are represented. And so the key here is that these subgroups should be as different as possible. And then we're going to simple random sample individuals from every single one of the subgroups, okay? So for example, I think I gave you an example down here. Maybe we have high school students and we want to make sure that we take a sample and end up with freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in our sample. So if we just did simple random sampling, it's possible that I might get a handful of freshmen, no sophomores, and then a lot of juniors and seniors, right? Just picking something randomly. Whereas if I do stratified, if I divide my population of high school students into subgroups or strata, and then I make sure each one is represented by sampling within each one. So in other words, those strata then would be freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And then once I've divided the students up into those subcategories or those strata, I would randomly sample from every single one of the subgroups. And that's important, is that those are the two keys, is that we're sampling from every subgroup and that the subgroups are as different as possible, okay? And so maybe if I have a situation like this, and I have my freshmen, my sophomores, my juniors, and my seniors, I might pick maybe a handful of freshmen, a handful of sophomores, a handful of juniors, a handful of seniors to try and make sure that every different group is represented. Okay. The difference then is in cluster sampling, which is another sampling method. I'm going to divide my population into clusters or groups that are this time as similar as possible. So with stratified, we wanted different groups and then we sampled from each group. With cluster, I'm still dividing into groups, but I want my groups to be similar as possible. And then I'm going to randomly select some of those entire clusters to make up my sample. So I'll pick whole clusters, and some of them I'll include the whole cluster. Others I will exclude the whole cluster. Whereas up here, we sampled from every group because they were different. Okay, so with cluster sampling, I might divide my groups into, or my population into groups that are as similar as possible. And then if I know that all of these groups are very similar, I can just take this entire group and that will represent all of the groups because they're all as similar as possible. Okay, that's done sometimes in order to save money or like trying to find different individuals. If you know that you have a lot of individuals that are pretty similar, then you can just find one subset of them and use them to represent the whole. Another type of sampling method is systematic sampling. This is where you're going to systematically choose individuals from your population to be included in your sample. And so an example here is maybe we make a list of individuals in the population, and then every 30th person on the list gets included in the sample. Or maybe I stand outside a grocery store, and as people walk in the store, every 15th person to walk in, I stop them and I ask them some questions. Okay, so that would be an example of systematic sampling. And then the last one here is convenient sampling. This is a sample that is convenient to select. So for example, if we wanted a sample of SCC students, it might be easy just to sample all the students in our particular class or classroom. While convenient sampling is convenient, it's not very strongly recommended because you can end up getting a sample that's not representative of your whole population. So for example, students that are all taking a statistics class are likely more similar. They might have a more similar major or more similar interests than students that are representing the whole student body at SCC.